Did you all know that today is the last day of the year? Well, at least in here it is. The Christian year starts next week, so things are plain. Next week when you walk in, there will be color and candles and wreaths, and the new year will begin with the first Sunday of Advent. At the beginning of our year, we start reliving the story of faith in a specific place, in a specific time, preparing for a very specific event. For our story starts with a ragged revolutionary prophet down by the river, telling everyone who would listen that the world was about to change and they need to prepare. And then we flash back to his birth and the days of waiting for another birth that would be long-lasting in effect. We celebrate the birth of the Christ child. We spend the rest of the year following his steps and his words, examining his choices and his teaching and ultimate death that leads to a renewed sense of hope for the future. Which brings us to this very last week. And this week, instead of looking back at this story, we're looking forward into the unknown. This is the day on which we begin to ask ourselves again, what have we learned? How have we been changed? Do we have a better understanding of God? What does this epic story that we have been following ask of us? And in the scriptures that we read today, Jesus is trying to answer those questions. Jesus and his disciples have just stepped out of the temple into the bright sunlight that's shimmering off the magnificent stones of the temple walls. And Herod had built the great walls of the temple, and in Jesus' day, the walls wrapped an area of 36 acres, the size of 7 football fields spread side by side. The walls were almost 200 feet high, 12-story building of walls, and they were amazing and solid and unmovable and secure. Who could blame the disciples who exclaimed, "Wow, look at these large stones and these massive buildings." They'd come there from the villages and were quite impressed, as we tend to be, for throughout time the truth is we humans are attracted to the biggest and the most amazing anything. We're drawn to the most influential and most powerful, the most splendid and grand accomplishments. And even if we weren't part of creating it, we want to claim it and be connected to it, to find our security in being a part of the biggest and the best. And we want to find our meaning in their power and their perfection. And at least the one dependable fact of life was that the temple was the biggest and the best, and it was going to be there forever. And one could be certain that that is where God could be found. But where others would gaze in wonder and pride, Jesus saw something else. He saw distraction and deception. He saw the cost of such supposed greatness in wasted resources and lost lives and taxes taken from people who couldn't afford it, and wealth spent on national glory in God's name while people suffered in poverty. So Jesus is standing in the same place that the prophets had stood for hundreds of years, telling discouraged and needy people that God is here, but you won't know it by admiring the stones. Jesus responded to their expression of awe with, "Do you see these great buildings? Don't put your hope there. Not one stone will be left upon another. They will all be thrown down." So surely they were shocked, and they grew quiet as they walked away and up the side of the Mount of Olives, looking back from a distance. And they gradually got up the courage to ask, "Well, okay, if this is true and these stones are coming down, if the temple is really going to fall, well, could you at least give us some signs so that we'll know when these things are going to happen?" So Jesus tried, "Okay, let's start with this. Don't be led astray. Lots of people are going to come in my name and say they're the Messiah and say now is the time, and they will lead many people astray. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. This will take place, but this is not the end. Nations are going to rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms, and there will still be earthquakes and there will be more famines. This is just the beginning of the birth pangs. The beginning of the birth pangs. These are the likely labor pains for which the Spirit is bringing something new into the world. So don't be alarmed. Don't be led astray. This is not a sign of the end, but the beginning of something new. The fulfillment of God's kingdom is coming into being slowly, painstakingly. Yes, life as they knew it was going to change. The temple, which was the economic and cultural and spiritual center of their world, would come crumbling down. And then there would still be wars and earthquakes and famines and plagues. But he also said very clearly, don't follow the people who say this is the end. Many have come and will keep coming, we know, in Jesus' name, saying, this is it, this is the end. Let's stop and sit and pray. Let's drink the Kool-Aid. Don't listen to them. Don't be led astray. This is going to be a slow process. These are only the early labor pains of a world that is waiting to be born. For the pains are not the same as the birth itself. They are the prelude. But whenever those pains begin, you know you need to be prepared. It's time to go to the hospital or wherever you're planning to give birth. When that water breaks and the labor begins, a mother-to-be has a sense of urgency about the future because something new is coming into the world, and life, at least as she knows it, will never be the same. When we begin to experience birth pangs, we should be ready, even if the birth itself is not yet coming. The birth of a baby will come in a matter of days or hours. God's time, the time it takes for spiritual renewal and transformation, is mapped in decades, in centuries, in generations. So Jesus is saying, don't sit around counting the days and looking for signs and waiting for God to do something. Because God is not starting the rumors or causing the wars. Just the opposite. God is calling you to be the change you want to see in the world. Thomas Truby points out that when Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, the disciples saw it as the end of the world. They experienced it as judgment from God. In their imaginations, God pours wrath upon them. Nothing gets spared. But Jesus doesn't believe in God's wrath. He knows that their fears are all projections of human wrath. Jesus knows that the destruction of the temple didn't have anything to do with God and never would, because God is not using wrath. And when we think that God uses wrath, we begin to think that we are his administrators, and we open ourselves to all kinds of violence and deception and exploitation. Wars and rumors of wars are a human thing, not a God thing. What is happening in the warring world is not the cosmic struggle between good and evil. It is humans in rivalry. And earthquakes are geological events requiring that we help each other. And famines, usually caused by our ignorance or our mismanagement of resources, they call us to share our food. But there is no divine punishment implied. Truby elaborates this vision. With the light of this gospel leading us, humans must learn to see what we have been blind to, that we are more alike than we ever dreamed, that the gospel is teaching us that the West is not better than the East or vice versa, that white is not better than black or vice versa, that sexual orientation, one is not superior to the other. Those are ours, of our making. But we worry if there are no dualities, with one being better than the other and one being worse, well, then how will we define ourselves? We might just have to learn to live by grace and forgiveness and let go of all those comparative categories. For when we are reading this gospel and these gospels, we learn that we are all children of God, loved and in need of mercy. And this does, in fact, undermine the world's order. It does so to bring this world order to an end, but it is not the end that we are thinking of. And just because we can't envision a world functioning like the kingdom of God that is described by the prophets and by Jesus, we begin to assume that there is no point in trying. This is the kind of thinking that frequently emerges in faith communities during times of great stress. We humans keep starting wars, and now with fracking, we are starting earthquakes and uncontrollable wildfires and unmanageable hurricanes. And the more overwhelmed and frightened we get, the more desperately we look for someone to blame, which leads to more wars and more waste and more terrorist attacks and more mass shootings and more fear and more isolation and more self-protection. And all of those events make us want to throw up our hands and wait for God to do something. But that is exactly what Jesus is telling us not to do. And that's what the whole story is about. And that's what every parable he tells is trying to say. God is working in creation, starting with us. People created in the image of a loving God, infused with a spirit that makes love possible, graced with wisdom and intelligence and creativity, and the ability to bring new possibilities into being. The Spirit is working in people touched by the Christ who forgives and draws us into unconditional relationship. So don't put your trust in the tallest buildings, the most celebrated celebrities, or the self-proclaimed greatest nation. Don't put your faith in the power of violence to bring your version of justice. Jesus died not returning violence for violence. He lived the law of love to the end. And we believe in the resurrection as God's vindication and affirmation of the way of love as the only way to change the world and to bring in the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. So perhaps Jesus' word for us today on this last day of the year, looking forward, is a word of encouragement to stand firm in these times of trouble, to continue offering words of hope in the midst of despair. He seems to be saying that change is coming, but don't look to the stones and don't look to the sky, because it's happening in you.